Welcome friends to the World Story Channel. I am your narrator Ramis. Enjoy listening to the full history of United States of America. Do not forget to write your opinion in the comments, and we will proceed. The history of America begins with the settlement of the North American continent by humans around 15,000 years BC. Gradually, numerous Native American cultures formed on the continent. In 1492, Christopher Columbus visited the islands of the West Indies, and during his second voyage in 1493, personally landed on the island of Puerto Rico, after which the existence of America became known in Europe. In 1498, John Cabot made a sea voyage to the shores of modern New England, and in 1513, the Spanish navigator Juan Ponce de Leon reached the shores of Florida. With the arrival of Europeans, the colonial history of America began. Most of the colonies were formed after 1600. The Spanish built small settlements in Florida and the Southwest, while the French built settlements along the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast. By the 1770s, the population of the 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast east of the Appalachians was 2.5 million. At the dawn of its independence, in 1776, the United States consisted of only 13 provinces that were part of British North America. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, they had to fight Britain twice in the War of Independence and in the War of 1812. According to the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783, Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States, but until the end of the Second Anglo-American War in 1815, it continued to support the Allied Indian tribes that resisted the U.S. Army. Immediately after the end of the War of Independence, the expansion of the United States began in a westerly direction, supported by the Americans' belief in an explicit destiny, according to which God predestined the existence of their state in America on the territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. The main territory of the United States was formed by 1912, when the last state, Arizona, was formed in their continental part. By this time, the territory of the states of Alaska and Hawaii also already belonged to the United States, but they were admitted to the Union as states only in 1959. The basis of the U.S. Constitution is the text approved in 1788, which includes the Declaration of Independence of the United States. The Supreme Court is the highest authority upholding constitutional law in the United States. Subsequently, a number of amendments were adopted to the Basic Law, which, in particular, prohibited slavery, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1865, and granted women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, 1920. The prohibition of slavery was a painful process that affected the interests of many citizens and vast regions of the American South, which provoked the collapse of the state and the Civil War in 1861-1865. It was followed by a long period of Reconstruction. Despite the prohibition of slavery, the results of Reconstruction were a compromise, and until the middle of the 20th century, the United States remained a country dominated by racial segregation. After the Civil War, the United States experienced rapid economic growth, rising living standards, and an era of progressivism. It ended with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. The measures taken by the government supported citizens who suffered during the economic downturn, which marked a new stage in the creation of a welfare state in the United States. The recovery of the American economy was facilitated by the government's military orders, which increased dramatically with the outbreak of World War II and then the Cold War, which led to the transformation of the United States into a global superpower. Early American history, before 1607, Paleo-Indian period. According to one theory, the first humans, Paleo-Indians, appeared in America about 15,000 years ago, arriving in Alaska through the frozen or shallow Bering Strait. Paleogeneticists who studied the genome of a girl who lived in the Tanana Valley in Alaska about 11.5 thousand years ago came to the conclusion that the ancestors of all American Indians migrated from Chukotka to Alaska in one wave in the late Pleistocene about 25,000 years ago, before Beringia disappeared approx. 20,000 years ago. After that, the ancient Beringians were isolated from Eurasia in America. Between 17 and 14,000 years ago, they were divided into the northern and southern groups of Paleo-Indians, which formed the peoples who inhabited North and South America. According to the calculations of geneticist Theodore Scher from the University of Pennsylvania, the carriers of mitochondrial haplogroup B entered North America up to 24,000 years ago. T. Scher and S. Sherry believed that the migration of carriers of mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, and D preceded Clovis and occurred 15 to 20,000 years ago. The second migration associated with the alleged carriers of mitochondrial haplogroup X from the Clovis culture took place after the formation of the Mackenzie Corridor 14 to 13,000 years ago. Artifacts from the late Paleolithic Cooper's Ferry site on the Salmon River, Columbia Basin, in Idaho, fragments of mammalian bones, remains of burnt coal, date back to the period 15, 28, 16, 56,000 years ago. Stone tools from Idaho have similarities with the industry of the late Pleistocene site of Kamishirataki II on the island of Hokkaido, Japan. This indicates that humans initially migrated to America along the Pacific coast, but does not exclude subsequent human migrations at a later time through the Ice-Free Corridor, IFC, from Beringia to present-day Dakota, which opened between the Cordillera and Laurentian continental ice sheets at the end of the Pleistocene, as paleogenomics suggests. According to some estimates, the Paleo-Indians appeared on the territory of Idaho in the Thi-3 millennium BC. Because in the Wilson Butte Cave near the town of Twin Falls, some of the most ancient arrowheads in the United States were discovered. DNA sequencing and identification of mitochondrial haplogroups A2 and B2 was carried out from pre-Clovis human coprolite samples from the Paisley Caves in Oregon, 14,290 12,650 years ago. A representative of the Clovis Anzic I culture from Montana, who lived 12.5 thousand years ago, had the Y chromosomal haplogroup QL54, XM3, and the mitochondrial haplogroup D4H3A. The ancient Beringians USR1 and USR2, who lived on the River of the Rising Sun in the Tanana Valley in Alaska 11.5 thousand years ago, had mitochondrial haplogroups C1b and B2. The mitochondrial haplogroup D4H3A has been identified in a sample from the On Your Knees cave on Prince of Wales Island, Alexander Archipelago in Alaska, aged 9730, 980 years. The Kennewick man from Washington State, who lived 9,300 years ago, revealed the Y chromosome group Q1A3A, M3, and the mitochondrial haplogroup X2A. The Kennewick man, who lived 9,300 years ago and was found in Washington State, had the Y chromosome group Q1A3A, M3, and the mitochondrial haplogroup X2A. The 10,700-year-old Spirit Cave mummy from Nevada has Y chromosome haplogroup Q1B1A1A1, M848. The Archaic period. About 10,000 years before the present, the glacier retreated, ocean levels rose, America's climate changed, and megafauna became completely extinct. There is a shock hypothesis of the late Dryas, suggesting that the extinction of megafauna is associated with the fall of a meteorite. Climate change forced people to change their lifestyle, which marked the transition from the Paleo-Indian period to the Archaic one. People began to hunt smaller game, eat fish and shellfish. The tools of labor are becoming more diverse. The first burials with signs of violent death date back to this era. By about 4000 BC, the climate of North America became close to modern. People began to lead a more sedentary lifestyle, and in the archaeological layers of that era, there are more and more traces of long-term settlements. At that time, native copper was used in the Great Lakes region, from which knives and jewelry were made by cold forging. The Archaic period lasted from 8000 BC to 1000, and became the longest historical period in the history of North America. The Woodland period. The Woodland period in the chronology of North America refers to the time from about 1000 BC to 1000 AD in the eastern part of North America. The boundary of its beginning is the end of the Archaic period, and the end is the emergence of the Mississippian culture. The Woodland period is characterized by the slow development of stone and bone tools, leather goods, fabric production, land cultivation, and the construction of dwellings. Some woodland peoples continued to use spears and atlatls until the end of the period, when they were replaced by bows and arrows. The main technological achievement of the woodland period was the widespread use of ceramics, which originated in the late Archaic period, as well as the increasing complexity of its forms and ornaments. The growing spread of the agricultural lifestyle also meant that nomadic tribes were being replaced by permanent settlements, although the final transition of the Indians to an agricultural lifestyle occurred much later under the Mississippian culture. Mississippian culture. The Mississippian culture existed in the Midwest, East, and Southeast of the modern United States from about 800 to 1600 AD and had great regional differences. It is characterized by the construction of large earthworks, especially mounds. At that time, people lived in large cities surrounded by suburbs, and such cities had trade links with each other. Cahokia, in what is now Illinois, is considered the largest of its kind. The Mississippian culture originated in the Mississippi River Valley, from where it got its name. From there, it spread up the tributaries of the Mississippi. At that time, people ate almost exclusively corn, social inequality and complex religious rituals developed, and the so-called Southeastern ceremonial complex developed. In the late phase of the period, 1400–1500, the Mississippian culture experienced a severe crisis. Many cities were abandoned. Cahokia was abandoned before 1400. Conquistador Hernando de Soto still saw some Mississippian cities during his journey of 1541–1542, but French explorers, when they discovered the Mississippi River in the 1680s, no longer found any signs of this culture. The discovery of America by Europeans. The discovery of America by Europeans, which changed the historical destinies of the continent and all mankind, was made in October 1492 by Christopher Columbus at the head of a Spanish expedition. Columbus, in particular, discovered the American Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, the second expedition of 1493. In 1497–1498, Captain J. Cabot reached the shores of New England, although the details of that journey are not known. In 1513, Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de León discovered the Florida Peninsula, where the first permanent European colony was established in 1565, and the city of St. Augustine was founded. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine in the French service, sailed from Cape Fear to Newfoundland and made a description of the coast. A year later, his journey was repeated by Esteban Gomez. In the late 1530s, Hernando de Soto discovered the Mississippi and reached the Arkansas River Valley. In 1540–1541, the expedition of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado to the Missouri River Basin led to the discovery of the Grand Canyon of Colorado. Englishman Walter Raleigh proposed to Queen Elizabeth to establish a colony on the American shores, received official permission for this in 1584, and on July 2, 1584, he reached the American coast in the area of the Outer Shoals. In June 1585, the first colony was founded, which soon had to be evacuated. In the spring of 1586, the Roanoke colony was founded, which mysteriously disappeared a few years later. But a study of the surroundings of Roanoke Island showed that this area was inconvenient for colonization, and it was decided to look for a more convenient coast further north, in the Chesapeake Bay area. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an Englishman in the service of the Dutch East India Campaign, explored the coast of New England, visited New York Bay, and sailed up the river that was named after him. The colonial period, 1607 to 1775, colonization of America by the British, 1607–1775, the first English settlement in America, arose in 1607 in Virginia and was named Jamestown. The trading post, founded by members of the crews of 3 British ships under the command of Captain Newport, served simultaneously as a guard post on the way of the Spanish advance inland. In just a few years, Jamestown has become a thriving settlement thanks to the tobacco plantations established there in 1609. By 1620, the population of the village was about 1,000 people. European immigrants were attracted to America by the rich natural resources of the distant continent, and its remoteness from European religious dogmas and political leanings. The exodus to the New World was financed primarily by private companies and individuals who earned income from transporting goods and people. In 1606, the London and Plymouth companies were formed in England, which began exploring the northeast coast of America. Many immigrants moved to the New World as whole families and communities at their own expense. Despite the attractiveness of the new lands, there was a constant shortage of human resources in the colonies. On July 30th, 1619, Virginia Governor George Yeardley called an elected assembly for the first time for a 6-day session in the Jamestown Church building. It was the first meeting of a representative legislative body in the Americas. At the end of August 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia, bringing black Africans to America, 20 of whom were bought by the colonists as slaves. In December 1620, the Mayflower arrived on the Atlantic coast of Massachusetts with 102 Calvinist Puritans. This event is considered the beginning of the purposeful colonization of the continent by the British. They concluded an agreement among themselves, called the Mayflower Agreement. It reflected in the most general form the ideas of the first American colonists about democracy, self-government, and civil liberties. Later, similar agreements were concluded between the colonists of Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. After 1630, at least a dozen small towns appeared in the Plymouth Colony, the first colony of New England, which later became the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where newly arrived English Puritans settled. The immigration wave of 1630–1643 brought about 20,000 people to New England, and at least 45,000 more settled in the colonies of the American South or on the islands of Central America. The 13 colonies. Over the course of 75 years after the first English colony of Virginia appeared in 1607, 12 more colonies arose. The Plymouth Colony, 1620, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1628, united in 1692 into the province of Massachusetts Bay. Province of Maryland, 1632, Colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, 1636. Colony of Connecticut, 1636. Province of New York, 1665. Province of New Jersey, 1665. Province of Carolina, 1665. In 1712 divided into O Province of North Carolina, O Province of South Carolina, Province of New Hampshire, 1679. Province of Pennsylvania, 1681. Province of Georgia, 1732. The first colonists of North America did not have a single religious beliefs or equal social status. For example, shortly before 1775, at least a third of Pennsylvania's population were already Germans, Lutherans, Mennonites, and representatives of other religious beliefs and sects. English Catholics settled in Maryland, and French Huguenots settled in South Carolina. The Swedes settled Delaware. Polish, German, and Italian artisans preferred Virginia. From among them, farmers recruited hired workers. Colonists often found themselves defenseless against Indian raids, one of which served as the impetus for the uprising in Virginia in 1676, known as the Bacon Rebellion. The uprising ended unsuccessfully after Bacon's unexpected death from malaria and the execution of 14 of his most active associates. Starting in the middle of the 17th century, Great Britain tried to establish full control over the economic operations of the American colonies, implementing a scheme in which all industrial goods, from metal buttons to fishing vessels, were imported by the colonies from the mother country in exchange for raw materials and agricultural goods. Under this scheme, British entrepreneurs, as well as the British government, were extremely uninterested in the development of industry in the colonies, as well as in trade between the colonies and anyone other than the mother country. Meanwhile, American industry, mainly in the northern colonies, has achieved significant success. American industrialists especially succeeded in building ships, which made it possible to quickly establish trade with the West Indies, and thereby find a market for domestic manufacture. The English Parliament considered these successes so threatening that in 1750 it passed a law prohibiting the construction of rolling mills and iron-cutting workshops in the colonies. The colonies' foreign trade was also harassed. In 1763, the shipping laws were passed, which allowed goods to be imported and exported from the American colonies only on British ships. In addition, all goods destined for the colonies had to be shipped to Great Britain, regardless of where they were shipped from. Thus, the metropolis tried to put all the foreign trade of the colonies under its control. And this is not counting the many duties and taxes on goods that the colonists personally imported home. The War with the French and Indians. In 1753, the French began to penetrate the Ohio River Valley. Virginia Governor Dinwiddie sent a diplomatic mission there, and then a small army, but it was defeated in the battle for Fort Necessity. At the same time, the Ulbin Congress met, at which the colonies tried to unite in the face of the French threat, but the Ulbin unification plan was not approved by the king. England decided to fight on its own, and sent 2 infantry regiments under the command of Edward Braddock to the colonies. However, Braddock's expedition was unsuccessful. In the first stage of the war, the French won several victories. In particular, they defeated the British in the Battle of Fort Carillon, but Great Britain managed to turn the tide of the war. Louisbourg fell in 1758, the French surrendered Fort Duquesne in the same year, and Quebec, the last French outpost in North America, fell in September 1759. In 1763, the Paris Peace Treaty was concluded, according to which France ceded to England and Spain all its possessions in America. The Revolution and the War of Independence. The American Revolution. After the end of the war with the French and Indians, the British Grenville government left an army in the colonies, and to maintain it in 1765, Parliament introduced the Stamp Duty Act in the American colonies. The assemblies of the colonies were inclined to accept this tax, but it provoked protests among the people. Under threat of reprisals, the colonists forced stamp distributors to resign from this position. Deputies of the provincial assemblies gathered at the Stamp Act Congress, which petitioned the king to abolish the stamp duty. In the summer of 1765, the first Rockingham government came to power, which abolished stamp duty, but at the same time issued an explanatory act that stated that Parliament had the right to impose taxes in the colonies. In 1767, Minister Charles Townshend managed to pass Townshend's laws through Parliament, which imposed duties on a number of goods. The British colonies declared a boycott of British goods, but the boycott did not last long. And in 1770, the North government abolished all duties except the duty on tea. In 1773, the British government passed a law allowing tea to be sold in the colony directly from India, believing that the low price of tea would force the colonists to accept the duty. The residents of Boston did not allow tea to be unloaded at their port, and on December 16, 1773, they threw all the tea into the sea. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. In response, North's government passed repressive laws against Massachusetts. The port was blocked until the city authorities paid compensation for the destroyed cargo. The Massachusetts Assembly called on the colonies to meet in Congress to discuss this issue together. On September 5, 1774, the First Continental Congress opened in Philadelphia, which brought together 55 delegates from all the colonies, with the exception of Georgia. At the Congress, demands were formulated for the metropolis. The Declaration of Rights contained a statement on the rights of the American colonies to life, liberty, and property, and the Continental Association document, developed at the same Congress, authorized the resumption of the boycott of British goods in the event of the British Crown's refusal to make concessions in its financial and economic policy. The declaration also expressed the intention to reconvene the next Continental Congress on May 10, 1775, if London remained adamant in its intransigence. The retaliatory steps of the metropolis were not long in coming. The king demanded the complete subordination of the colonies to the authority of the British Crown, and the British fleet began to blockade the northeastern coast of the American continent. General Gage was ordered to suppress the open rebellion and ensure that the colonies comply with repressive laws, resorting to the use of force if necessary. The First Continental Congress, and especially London's reaction to its decisions, convincingly demonstrated to the Americans that their strength lies in unity, and that one should not count on the favor of the British Crown and its condescending attitude towards their demands for independence. In April 1775, the British military clashed with the Massachusetts militia, known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord. The English detachment was defeated, retreated to Boston, and the militia began the siege of Boston. On May 10th, the militia captured Fort Ticonderoga. On the same day, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, which declared the Massachusetts militia the Continental Army, and George Washington was declared the commander of the army. It was also decided to strike at the British Army in Canada. In the fall, the offensive against Quebec by two armies began, but these armies were defeated near Quebec and retreated to Fort Ticonderoga. The failure of the attack on Canada showed that the war could not be won without allies, and to conclude an alliance, independence must be declared. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee invited Congress to consider independence. On June 28th, Thomas Jefferson's draft Declaration of Independence was ready. It was discussed for 3 days, after which it was officially adopted on July 4, 1776. In the same year, each of the 13 colonies created its own constitution, and thus the colonies were transformed into states. The state of New York was formed on June 10, 1776, and the state of North Carolina only on December 18th, the American War of Independence. In March 1776, the British Army left Boston, but in August, shortly after the Declaration of Independence, it landed on the coast of New York State, and the campaign in New York and New Jersey began. The Continental Army was defeated in the Battle of Long Island and abandoned New York. Washington, after a series of defeats, was forced to retreat through New Jersey to Pennsylvania. The British held the city of New York until the conclusion of a peace treaty in 1783, turning it into their main stronghold in North America. Following the retreating American troops, the British Army invaded New Jersey, but here Washington launched a counterattack. On Christmas night, in December 1776, his army crossed the Delaware and defeated the enemy at Trenton and Princeton. The British campaign plan of 1777, developed in London, consisted of organizing a simultaneous offensive from Canada and along the Hudson River to capture Albany in 1777 and cut off New England from the southern colonies, the Saratoga campaign. But the Canadian army under the command of General Burgoyne was defeated at Saratoga and capitulated, with the condition of repatriation to Great Britain. But the Continental Congress did not approve the terms of their surrender, and the surrendered army remained in America until the end of the war. The victory at Saratoga accelerated the entry of France into an alliance with the United States, which was concluded in 1778. Spain and the Netherlands then joined the alliance, and a new Anglo-French war began. Later, the British concentrated their forces on attempts to capture the southern states. With a limited contingent of troops, they relied on the mobilization of loyalists. This tactic helped them hold their ground in the Northwest Territories, despite the defeat of Canadian forces while trying to advance on Albany. At the end of 1778, the British Navy landed troops and captured the capital of Georgia, the city of Savannah. In 1780, Charleston was captured. But the Loyalists who gathered under the British banner were not enough to advance inland, and the British had to settle for control of the port cities. Further offensives into North Carolina and Virginia stalled. A guerrilla war broke out in the occupied territories, and Loyalist detachments were slaughtered. The remnants of the British Army headed for the city of Yorktown, where they were going to board the ships of the British fleet. But the fleet collided with the French fleet in the Chesapeake Bay and retreated. The trapped troops of British General Cornwallis surrendered to General Washington in October 1781. When reports of this defeat reached Britain, Parliament decided to begin peace talks with the American rebels. The formation of the American State, 1783-1812. The Confederate period, 1781-1789. In 1781, the U.S. Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, which marked the beginning of the existence of the American Confederation, a weak community of states with a very weak federal government. The country was governed by an assembly of deputies who acted on behalf of the state they represented. This unicameral assembly, known as the Congress of the Confederation, had insufficient powers and was unable to act independently of the states. There was no chief executive officer, and there was no judicial system. Congress had no power to impose taxes, regulate domestic or international trade, or negotiate with other states. The government's inability to cope with the emerging problems led to demands for reform, and even talk of secession of the states. When all congressional attempts to improve the Articles of Confederation failed, national leaders met in Philadelphia in 1787 to create a new constitution. It was ratified in 1788, and in 1789, a new federal government began to assemble, marking the end of the Confederate period. The presidency of George Washington, 1789-1797. The presidency of George Washington began on April 30th, 1789, when he was inaugurated as the first president of the United States, and ended on March 4th, 1797. George Washington became president following the results of the presidential election of 1789, the first in the history of the United States, where he became the only candidate elected unanimously. In 1792, he was also unanimously re-elected for a second term, and in 1797, he refused a third term. He was succeeded by Vice President John Adams of the Federalist Party. At the time of his election, Washington was 57 years old. Before the election, he was widely known in the country as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army and as President of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Since the adoption of the Constitution, society assumed that he would become the first president, although Washington himself was going to retire from public life. In his inaugural address, he said that he was reluctant to accept the presidency and that he was not familiar with the civil administration. Despite this, he has shown himself to be a capable leader. Washington's efforts created the first federal government, appointed all top-ranking officials of the executive and judicial branches of government, established many traditions of political life, and selected a location for the country's permanent capital. He supported Alexander Hamilton's economic policy, according to which the government assumed the external debt of the states, created the first Bank of the USA, the U.S. Mint, and the Customs Service. Under Washington, Congress passed laws on duties, the Tariff of 1789 and the Tariff of 1790, and raised the whiskey tax, which led to a riot, see the Whiskey Rebellion, and Washington had to personally lead troops to suppress it. Under his leadership, the Northwest Indian War continued, during which the United States managed to subjugate the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory. In international politics, he adhered to the practice of neutrality and non-interference, and in 1793 issued a proclamation on neutrality. He succeeded in concluding two important agreements, the Jay Treaty with Great Britain in 1794 and the Pinckney Treaty with Spain in 1795. The United States Navy was created by decree of 1794 to protect American merchant ships from Barbary pirates. Expansion, 1783-1853. According to the peace treaty with Great Britain, the western border of the United States was established along the Mississippi River, and the northern one, in turn, along the Great Lakes. Previously, the British had left the territories between the Mississippi and the Appalachian Mountains to their Indian allies. Florida was returned to Spain. After the end of the American Revolutionary War, the United States continued to wage war against the Indians in the Northwest Territories, which ended in 1795 with the signing of the Greenville Peace Treaty, according to which the Indian Confederation recognized the sovereignty of the United States and allowed white settlers to their lands. In addition, the United States negotiated with Spain on the disputed Southwestern Territories, where active hostilities with the Indians were also conducted. According to the Madrid Treaty concluded in 1795, Spain recognized these lands as the possession of the United States and demarcated the border between them and Spanish Florida along the 31st parallel. In 1798, the Mississippi Territory was created there. After the Anglo-American War of 1812-15, the Indians lost the support of Great Britain and could not provide significant resistance to American expansion. In the 1830s, by decisions of Congress and the administration of President Jackson, many Indians were evicted across the Mississippi River. Since the beginning of the 19th century, thousands of Americans have been leaving the increasingly densely populated east of the United States and heading west from the Mississippi River to a completely undeveloped region called the Great Plains. At the same time, New Englanders flocked to the forest-rich Oregon, while immigrants from the southern states settled in the expanses of Texas, New Mexico, and California. The main means of transport for these pioneer settlers were horse or bull-drawn wagons. Caravans of several dozen wagons each set off on their way. It took an average of about 6 months for such a caravan to travel from the Mississippi Valley to the Pacific coast. After gold was discovered in California in 1848, the so-called California Gold Rush began, which increased the flow of immigrants. For a number of religious groups, resettlement to sparsely populated Western territories provided an opportunity to avoid external influence and conflicts with representatives of major faiths and the authorities. One example of this is the Mormons who settled in Utah in 1847, the Louisiana Purchase, 1803-1804. In 1803, thanks to the successful actions of American diplomats, a deal was concluded between the United States of North America and France, called the Louisiana Purchase, which allowed the states to practically double their territory. But the main achievement of this deal for the United States at that time was to put the Mississippi River, an important transportation artery that had previously been a border river, at the full disposal of American farmers and traders. The Anglo-American War, 1812-1815, during the Napoleonic Wars, the United States maintained neutrality and tried to trade with all the belligerents, but both France and Britain discouraged trade with their opponents. After the defeat of the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, the British Navy blockaded American ports in an attempt to hinder Franco-American trade relations. Moreover, on their ships, the British continued to treat the Americans as their rebellious subjects and forced the sailors from the intercepted American ships to serve in the Royal Navy. In addition, Great Britain entered into an alliance with Indian tribes and supported their resistance to American expansion into Indian territories. In 1812, Congress declared war on England. After heavy fighting that lasted until 1815, peace was concluded, as a result of which the warring parties remained within the same borders. But Great Britain refused to ally with the Indians, who turned out to be the most affected party to the conflict. The United States emerged from the war with confidence in its abilities, in particular, thanks to its impressive victory in the decisive battle with the British near New Orleans. Despite the end of hostilities, there were still many controversial issues between the United States and Great Britain, including the borders between the United States and British Canada. To a large extent, they were settled during the post-war negotiations, which ended with the conclusion of the Anglo-American Convention of 1818. The issues that remained unresolved, in particular, about the status of the modern northwest of the United States, were settled with the conclusion of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 and the Oregon Treaty of 1846. The era of good agreement. The war with Britain led to the decline of the Federalist Party, the collapse of the first-party system, and the transition to a one-party system that coincided with the presidency of James Monroe. During these years, raids by Florida Indians led to the First Seminole War. An agreement was concluded with England on the demilitarization of the Great Lakes. Illinois and Alabama were annexed to the Union, but Missouri's application for admission to the Union led to disputes about the permissibility of the spread of slavery to new territories and the adoption of the Missouri Compromise. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams managed to reach an agreement with Spain, and the Adams-Onis Treaty was concluded, which recognized Spain's right to Texas, clarified the western border of the United States, and transferred East and West Florida to the ownership of the United States. Monroe's second term coincided with the formation of independent states in South America. In 1822, the United States recognized Colombia, followed by Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. The following year, it became known that the French army had suppressed the revolution in Spain, and there were fears that France, with the support of the Holy Alliance, would try to return the Spanish colonies. In 1823, in his address to Congress, Monroe stated that the United States would not interfere in the affairs of the existing colonies, but was ready to protect the interests of those states that had already achieved independence. This statement became known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Age of Jacksonian Democracy. The Oregon Treaty. According to the 1818 treaty, the border between the United States and British North America was drawn along the 49th parallel from Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. The territory of Oregon, located west of the Rocky Mountains, was recognized as free for joint use by the British and Americans. The Americans have repeatedly tried to gain full control over Oregon. On June 15, 1846, a treaty was signed between the United States and Great Britain, according to which the border between British and American possessions in Oregon was also drawn along the 49th parallel. The second party system, In the 1824 presidential election, 4 candidates from the same party, Democratic-Republican, competed for the presidency, and Andrew Jackson won. However, his policies led to a split within the party and the end of the one-party period. To win the 1828 election, Jackson created the Democratic Party, and his opponents, supporters of John Quincy Adams, created the National Republican Party, which in 1832 turned into the Whig Party. Its founder and first leader was Henry Clay. Annexation of Texas. In 1835, General Santa Anna removed Mexican President Gómez Farías from power, abolished the Mexican Constitution of 1824, and announced the creation of a new centralist state. This led to uprisings in the northern states of Mexico. The Mexican government sent an army here, led by the president himself, General López de Santa Anna. In the spring of 1836, he managed to capture the Alamo Mission, but a month later, Texas Army units defeated the Mexicans at the Battle of San Jacinto, and their president was captured and signed a treaty on Texas independence, and was transported to the United States. Mexico refused to ratify the treaty signed by the captive president, and despite the cessation of hostilities, the status of Texas remained legally uncertain. The Mexicans appealed to the United States to recognize their state, but Congress refused, expecting that Texas would first be recognized by some European power. In the United States, calls began for the recognition and annexation of Texas, but this proposal raised objections from politicians in the northern states who did not want to annex new slave states to the United States. During the 1844 presidential election, the Democratic candidate was James Polk, whose program implied the annexation of Texas. Polk's electoral victory showed that public opinion generally supports the annexation of Texas. In February 1845, the annexation of Texas was discussed in the Senate and reached an impasse, 26 votes in favor and 26 votes against. But then the senator from Louisiana changed his mind, and the treaty with Texas was adopted. On July 4, 1845, the Texas Convention approved the American-Texas Treaty, and on December 29, 1845, President Polk officially accepted Texas into the United States. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848. In April 1846, the Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande River and surrounded the American Fort Brown. Taylor's army launched a blockade of the fort and defeated the Mexicans at the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. On May 13th, the United States declared war on Mexico, and at the same time, Congress authorized the president to form an army for the war. In June, Taylor launched an offensive in northern Mexico, approached Monterrey, and stormed it on September 24th. President Polk assumed that the fall of Monterrey would force Mexico to negotiate, but the Mexicans decided to move on to a protracted war. Then the American command decided to change its strategy and launch an offensive against Mexico City from Veracruz. On October 22nd, Taylor was ordered to suspend hostilities in Mexico and transfer part of the troops to General Scott for the attack on Veracruz. Upon learning of Taylor's weakening, General Santa Anna sent an army north and attacked Taylor on February 22, 1847 at Buena Vista. But at the Battle of Buena Vista, the American army held its position. In March 1847, Scott's Mexican campaign began. Scott's army landed at Veracruz on March 9th and besieged the city. On March 29th, the city surrendered. Scott began the march on Mexico City and defeated the enemy in a defensive position at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. Scott occupied the city of Puebla, where, after a short pause, he began marching on Mexico City. On August 1920, the battles of Contreras and Churubusco took place. On September 13th, Chapultepec Castle fell, and on September 14th, John Quitman's infantry brigade was the first to enter Mexico City. The fall of the capital forced the Mexican side to negotiate, and as a result, on February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Mexico renounced its claims to Texas and transferred all of Upper California to the United States, thereby losing 55% of its territory. In 1853, Mexico ceded another part of its territory to the United States as a result of a deal called the Gadsden Treaty, which finally formed the new U.S.-Mexican border. The birth of the Republican Party, immediately after the end of the Mexican War. Disputes over slavery escalated in the country. The 1848 presidential election was won by Zachary Taylor, who in 1849 declared his willingness to accept California into the Union as a free state, contrary to the compromise rules of 1820. This led to a fierce dispute, which resulted in a compromise in 1850. The Southern states agreed to the annexation of California, but the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in their interests. In May 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which decreed that the status of slavery in Kansas would be decided by its residents themselves. In July of the same year, the abolitionists of the northern states gathered at a convention and united in the Republican Party, whose goal was to combat the spread of slavery. Supporters and opponents of slavery began to flock to Kansas, which led to armed clashes and the outbreak of the Civil War in Kansas. As a result, the stubborn resistance of free farmers forced Congress to recognize the state as free from slavery by 1859. Meanwhile, the Republicans quickly seized power in Michigan. In the 1856 elections, they took all the seats of the Michigan delegation in the U.S. Congress and all the top positions in Michigan. In 1857, radical Republican Zachary Chandler became a senator, and in 1859, Michigan Governor Kinsley Bingham also entered the U.S. Senate. And now the party was under the control of radicals who were ready to end slavery at any cost. The Civil War, 1861-1865. After the victory of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 elections, 11 Southern states announced their secession from the United States, forming a new rebel state, the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, the first battle took place in South Carolina, during which the Confederate armed forces captured Fort Sumter, a fortification of the Federal Army. Initially, the war was fought with varying success, and mainly on the territory of Virginia and Maryland. A turning point occurred in 1864, when Lincoln appointed Ulysses Grant as commander-in-chief. The Army of the Northerners, under the command of William Sherman, conducted a successful offensive from Tennessee to Atlanta, Georgia, defeating the troops led by Confederate generals Johnston and Hood. During the famous March to the Sea, Sherman's army destroyed about 20% of all farms in Georgia and reached the Atlantic Ocean in Savannah in December 1864. The war ended with the surrender of General Lee's army in Virginia on April 9, 1865. The United States between the Civil War and the interwar period, 1865 or 1918. The era of Reconstruction, the period after the end of the Civil War, lasted from 1865 to 1877. At this time, the Reconstruction Amendments were introduced into the Constitution, which expanded civil rights for African Americans. These amendments include the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing citizenship to all those born or naturalized in the United States, and the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote for men of all races. In response to Reconstruction, a number of Southerner organizations appeared, including the Ku Klux Klan, which opposed the realization of civil rights of the colored population. Violence by such organizations was countered by the federal army and the authorities, who adopted, in particular, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1870, declaring it a terrorist organization. Nevertheless, in the Supreme Court case, USA versus Cruikshank, the observance of civil rights of the population was entrusted to the state authorities. The failures of the Republican authorities aggravated the economic crisis of 1873. Eventually, the Republican governments lost the support of the voters of the southern states, and the Democrats returned to power in the South, who did not restore slavery, but passed discriminatory laws called Jim Crow laws. In 1877, the Army's participation in government in the South was discontinued. As a result, African Americans became second-class citizens, and the racist principles of white supremacy continued to dominate public opinion. The Democratic Party's monopoly on power in the southern states continued after that until the 1960s. The expansion of gold prospectors, farmers, and owners of vast ranches into the Wild West was accompanied by numerous conflicts with Indians. The last large-scale armed conflict between white Americans and the indigenous population was the War for the Black Hills, 1876-77, although individual skirmishes with small groups of Indians continued until 1918. The Gilded Age, 1872 till 1900. The end of the 19th century was a time of powerful industrial development in the United States. The Gilded Age, as the classic American writer Mark Twain dubbed this era. The wealthiest class of American society basked in luxury, but they also did not forget about philanthropy, which Carnegie called the gospel of wealth, supporting thousands of colleges, hospitals, museums, academies, schools, theaters, libraries, orchestras, and charitable societies. John Rockefeller alone donated over $500 million to charity, which accounted for more than half of his total income. An unprecedented wave of immigrants, mostly from Europe, brought not only labor for the American industry to the United States, but also created a variety of national communities inhabiting sparsely populated Western territories. It is believed that the modern American economy was created in the era of the Gilded Age. In the 1870s and 1880s, the economy as a whole, as well as wages, wealth, national product, and capital in the United States, grew at the fastest pace in the country's history. Thus, between 1865 and 1898, wheat crops increased by 256%, corn by 222%, coal mining by 800%, and the total length of railway tracks by 567%. The corporation has become the dominant form of business organization. By the beginning of the 20th century, per capita income and industrial output in the United States had become the highest in the world. Per capita income in the United States was twice as high as in Germany, France, and Britain by 50%. During the era of the technological revolution, businessmen built new industrial cities in the northeastern United States with city-forming factories, and factories employing hired workers from different European countries. Multimillionaires such as John Rockefeller, Andrew Mellon, Andrew Carnegie, John Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the Astor family gained a reputation as robber barons. Workers began to form small unions at the time, such as the American Federation of Labor. By 1871, the U.S. authorities had decided that agreements with the Indians were no longer required, and that no Indian nation or tribe should be considered an independent nation or state. By 1880, as a result of the mass shooting of the American bison, almost its entire population had disappeared, and the Indians had lost the object of their main fishery. The authorities forced the Indians to abandon their usual way of life and live only on reservations. Many Indians resisted this. One of the leaders of the resistance was Sitting Bull, the leader of the Sioux tribe. The Sioux inflicted several stunning blows on the American cavalry, winning the Battle of the Little Bighorn River in 1876. But the Indians could not live on the prairies without bison, and, exhausted by hunger, they eventually submitted and moved to reservations. The era of progressivism, 1900 and 1914. After the Gilded Age came the era of progressivism, which is characterized by high political activity of the middle class and the social lower classes, which led to large-scale social and political reforms. In particular, 4 new constitutional amendments were adopted, from the 16th to the 19th. One of the goals of the progressive movement was to fight the corruption of the U.S. political elite. Some progressives also advocated the closure of drinking establishments and the adoption of prohibition. The progressives were joined by supporters of women's suffrage, as well as better health care and modernization in a number of other areas of public life. At first, the progressive movement operated only at the local and regional levels, and only after a while did it take over the entire nation. Progressives borrowed many ideas from Western Europe, in particular the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. The ideas of progressives were shared by many U.S. political leaders, including Republicans Theodore Roosevelt, Robert La Follette, Charles Hughes, Herbert Hoover, and Democrats William Bryan, Woodrow Wilson, and others. The United States in World War I, 1914, 1918. The period of neutrality, 1914, 1917. At the beginning of the war, the United States was dominated by the desire to remain neutral. President Wilson, shocked by the destructive nature of the conflict and concerned about its possible adverse consequences for the United States in the event of prolonged hostilities, tried to act as a mediator between the warring parties. But his peacemaking efforts were unsuccessful, mainly due to the fact that both sides did not lose hope of winning the decisive battle. Meanwhile, the United States has become increasingly embroiled in a dispute over the rights of neutral countries at sea. Great Britain controlled the situation on the oceans, allowing neutral countries to trade, and at the same time, blocking German ports. Germany tried to break the blockade using a new weapon: submarines. In 1915, a German submarine sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, killing more than 100 American citizens. Wilson immediately told Germany that unprovoked submarine attacks on ships of neutral countries were a violation of generally accepted norms of international law and should be stopped. Germany agreed in early 1917 to end unrestricted submarine warfare, but only after Wilson threatened to use the most drastic measures. Nevertheless, in February and March 1917, several more American ships were sunk. And Zimmerman's telegram to the Mexican government proposing an alliance against the United States forced Wilson to request congressional approval for the country's entry into the war. As a result, on April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany. U.S. involvement in World War I, 1917-1918. The United States immediately expanded the scale of economic and naval assistance to the Allies and began training an expeditionary force to join the fighting on the Western Front. According to the law on limited military service adopted on May 18, 1917, 1 million men between the ages of 21 and 31 were drafted into the Army. From the beginning of March 1918, the Allies held back a powerful German offensive. By the summer, with the support of American reinforcements, it was possible to launch a counter-offensive. The U.S. Army successfully operated against the enemy's entrenched Saint-Mihiel group and took part in the general offensive of the Allied forces. To effectively organize the rear, Wilson took unprecedented measures of state control over the economy. The Federal Control Act, passed on March 21, 1918, placed all the country's railroads under the leadership of William McAdoo, and a specially created military railroad administration was supposed to end competition and ensure strict coordination of their activities. The Military Industrial Directorate was given expanded powers of control over enterprises in order to stimulate production and prevent unnecessary duplication. Guided by the Food and Fuel Control Act, August 1917, Herbert Hoover, head of the Federal Food Control Agency, fixed wheat prices at a high level and introduced the so-called wheat-free and wheat-free days in order to increase food supplies to the Army. Harry Garfield, the head of the Fuel Control Agency, also took tough measures regarding the production and distribution of fuel resources. In addition to solving military problems, these measures have brought considerable benefits to the poor social strata, in particular farmers and industrial workers. In addition to the large costs of developing its own military machine, the United States provided such large loans to the Allies that between December 1916 and June 1919, the total debt of the latter, together with interest, rose to $24,262 million. A serious flaw in Wilson's domestic policy was his inability to reliably protect civil liberties. Military hysteria inside the country resulted in the persecution of Americans of German descent, members of anti-war groups, and other dissidents. In January 1918, Wilson submitted to Congress his 14 points, the general declaration of the goals of the United States in the war. The declaration outlined a program for restoring international stability and called for the creation of the League of Nations. This program was in many ways at odds with the military objectives previously approved by the Entente countries and included in a number of secret treaties. In October 1918, the Central European countries made a peace proposal directly to Wilson, over the heads of European opponents. After Germany agreed to make peace under the terms of the Wilson program, the President sent Colonel E.M. House to Europe to gain the consent of the Allies. House successfully completed his mission, and on November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice agreement. Despite the preliminary agreement on its terms, the differences in the positions of Europe and America indicated that serious contradictions would arise during the post-war negotiations. Another problem was the actual disintegration of old Europe, which did not promise a quick and easy recovery of economic life. Towards peace, 1919-1920. During the peace negotiations, Wilson subordinated all other tasks to the creation of the League of Nations. To achieve this goal, he made a number of compromises, in particular on indemnities and territorial issues, hoping to subsequently adjust them within the framework of the future League. At the negotiating table with other members of the Big Four, Lloyd George, representing Great Britain, Clemenceau, representing France, and Orlando, representing Italy, Wilson proved himself to be a very skilled diplomat. The Treaty of June 28, 1919, was the culmination of his political career. However, in the United States itself, after the Republican victory in the 1918 elections, internal political tensions intensified. Senator Lodge led the movement against the League of Nations. He and his supporters managed to block the consideration of the treaty in the Senate for a long time and disrupt its ratification. The opposition senators received the support of, firstly, Republicans who feared the adverse political consequences of Wilson's diplomatic triumph. Secondly, representatives of those ethnic groups whose countries suffered from the Versailles Accords. And finally, those progressive radicals who believed that the international obligations of the United States would slow down the further development of American democracy. The camp of American supporters of the League of Nations was unexpectedly weakened when Wilson, who had undertaken an exhausting propaganda tour of the country in support of the peace treaty, fell seriously ill in the midst of the debate. The Red Panic caused by fear of the communists intensified the disillusionment that gripped the country after the war. It was clear that the Senate would not pass the treaty without making changes to it, but Wilson refused to compromise, and the Senate rejected it twice, in November 1919 and in March 1920. Therefore, the United States remained formally at war until July 2, 1921, when Congress, already under the Harding administration, finally adopted a joint resolution of both chambers officially declaring the end of hostilities. The League of Nations began its work without the participation of the United States. The United States, between the World Wars, 1918 1941, Prosperity, 1922, 1929. The era of prosperity is the period of economic recovery in the United States in the 1920s. In literature, the era of prosperity is most often understood to mean unhealthy, questionable prosperity. Post-war America became a leader in terms of economic growth, which further consolidated its leading position in the world. By the end of the 1920s, America was producing almost as much industrial output as the rest of the world. The average worker's salary increased by 25%. The unemployment rate did not exceed 5%, and in some periods even 3%. Consumer credit was flourishing. Prices were maintained at a stable level. The pace of economic development in the United States remained the fastest in the world. After the end of Woodrow Wilson's second term, Republicans came to power for 12 years. Warren Harding, 1921, 1923. Then, after his death, Calvin Coolidge, 1923, 1929, and Herbert Hoover, 1929, 1933. The U.S. population was tired of progressive reforms, and therefore the transition to conservatism was more welcome than ever. During this period, Republicans saw their main goal as 1. Stability, 2. Ensuring reliable economic performance, 3. Assistance to companies with the organization of their activities, opening up foreign markets for them. However, the economic boom period began very unpleasantly. Government orders and foreign demand for American goods decreased. The soldiers who returned from the fronts could not find work. The number of unemployed increased from 0.5 million to 5 million. In 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the Prohibition Law, came into force. Alcohol smuggling and the production of moonshine at home began. In this regard, in 1920-21, there was a recession in the economy, and only in 1923 began the process of recovery. The reasons for the rise of the American economy are seen in the rise of the United States to a leading position in international politics and its transformation into the financial center of the world. With considerable funds at their disposal, the American monopolies have successfully renovated their fixed assets, and new factories have been built. In 1924, at the initiative of the United States, the Dawes Plan for the restoration of the German economy was adopted. Germany was allocated a loan, a significant part of which was provided by U.S. banks. The desire of the United States to contribute to the economic stability of Europe was explained by the desire to conquer new markets for American goods, as well as the desire to prevent the spread of communist ideology. At the same time, in 1921, the United States provided charitable assistance to Soviet Russia, where famine was raging. By 1929, the total volume of American exports was $85 million in monetary terms. President Harding has formed a cabinet of prominent financiers, millionaires, and people well versed in economics. In 1921 versus 1932, the post of Secretary of the Treasury of the United States was held by the multimillionaire E. Mellon. On his initiative, the tax rate on incomes exceeding $1 million was reduced first to 66.50% and in 1926 to 20%. The wartime laws passed to control the price level were repealed. The use of antitrust laws against corporations has ceased, which were effectively annulled by the Supreme Court through various clarifications and interpretations. At the same time, persecution intensified, and their numbers decreased by 1.5 times by 1930. In 1925, Calvin Coolidge declared, "America's business is business," which in domestic politics meant following the principles of laissez-faire, which opened up freedom of action for businessmen and guaranteed them from government interference in the activities of the private sector of the economy. The high protectionist customs tariffs of the late 19th century, which were declared one of the foundations of prosperity, were returned. The national debt has decreased, taxes have decreased. During the years of prosperity, an increase in per capita income and production efficiency led to a 40% increase in GNP. The country has the highest standard of living in the world, with low unemployment, low inflation, and low interest rates on loans. Industrial production as a whole increased by 72% by 1929. The production of consumer goods was particularly successful. The impetus for its development was the widespread distribution of electric energy. Americans' electrified homes began to be equipped with household appliances, radios, refrigerators, and so on. By the end of the 1920s, most industrial enterprises had switched to electric power. During Coolidge's presidency, extremely low purchase prices were set for agricultural raw materials to be used in industry. The concentration of capital occurred mainly in the electric power industry, the automotive industry, radio, and the developing film industry. The national wealth of the United States reached $450 billion by 1928. Big business has become even bigger. Corporations such as General Motors, Chrysler, General Electric, US Rubber, and others have come to the fore. By increasing the production of goods and capturing sales markets, such companies received more and more profits, which went to further development and expansion of production capacities. As a result, even more goods were produced, which were readily bought up by consumers. In the 1920s, the United States became the world's largest lender and increased its share of loans by 58%. The symbol of America in the 1920s can be considered Henry Ford and his Ford Model T, the first mass-produced car in world history. This vehicle was available to many, as its price was less than $300, and the average annual salary of an industrial worker was $1,300. As a result, the car ceased to be a luxury and turned into a means of transportation. In the 1920s, the car fleet grew by 250%, and by 1929, it had exceeded 25 million cars, despite the fact that the US population at that time was 125 million people. The development of the automotive industry has contributed to infrastructure development, construction and development of roads, hotels, gas stations, fast food outlets. Legislative acts of 1916, 1921, and 1925 provided for the creation of a nationwide network of numbered highways. By 1929, 250,000 miles of modern highways had been built, 1.5 times more than existed 20 years earlier. The growth of American exports, as the car has become the main export product. The development of the chemical and steel industries. Production increased by 20% per year. The fuel and energy complex. Oil production increased 1.5 times. The production of glass, rubber, and so on. The creation of new jobs. Every 12th worker was employed in the automotive industry. The development of conveyor production. This allowed the capitalists to reduce the number of workers, leaving only the most hardy and able-bodied who received higher salaries. In general, the 1920s were the time of the formation of a consumer society. The average American was subjected to massive pressure from manufacturers of goods. He was constantly besieged by calls to buy and buy even more. In this regard, modern advertising began to develop. Manufacturers did everything to force the buyer not to put money on hold, but to spend it immediately. Those who did not have the required amount with them were offered to purchase in installments. The concept of life on credit appeared when most of the cars, refrigerators, and radios were purchased in this way. However, the problem of uneven income distribution was not taken into account. 2/3 of American families were unable to purchase even basic necessities. Some of the profits of the monopolies were turned into securities, shares, which absorbed the retained earnings. Stocks were valued because they were bought and could be used to make money. The country advertised easy paths to wealth through stocks, and by 1929, at least 1 million Americans were trading on the stock exchange, who, having invested all their limited funds in buying stocks, were waiting for success. J. Raskob, chairman of the General Motors Finance Committee, argued in those years that if you save $15 a week and buy stocks with this money, then in 20 years you will be able to accumulate capital of $80,000. Holders of securities got into huge debts and actively used loans. Results. For the first time in American history, there were more residents in cities than in rural areas, which led to the emergence of urban agglomerations. The so-called rural population decline, in the decade of prosperity, amounted to 6.3 million people. By the end of 1929, the United States was producing 5.4 million cars annually. The United States accounted for 48% of the industrial production of the entire capitalist world. 10% more than Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The lion's share of production came from large corporations, which can be called creators of prosperity. The volume of production increased 4.5 times, and the total market value tripled. The development of the U.S. economy was not permanent. In 1924 and 1927, there were minor short-term recessions. But each time after that, the American economy continued to develop with renewed vigor. However, in 1929, at the end of October, the Great Depression began, and 4 years later, the United States lay in economic ruins. Living on credit has not led to endless and unhindered growth. In the banking sector, 5,000 banks were closed in the 1920s. The level of industrial production has fallen by 1/3, and unemployment has increased by 20%. The decline in agriculture began as early as 1921. There were also problems in the international arena. By persistently seeking repayment of debt from the European powers, in total, the Entente countries owed about $20 billion, the Americans promoted an increase in customs duties on European goods. At the same time, during the period of prosperity, such industries as coal, light, shoe, food, and textile industries, and shipbuilding did not develop properly. Coal production decreased by 30%. The economic boom led to a crisis of overproduction. By 1929, the market was overflowing with various goods, but these goods were no longer in demand. The Great Depression and the New Deal. The Great Depression in the United States began with the stock market crash at the end of 1929 and lasted until the entry into World War II. The spiraling deflation made the production of goods unprofitable. As a result, production declined, while unemployment increased sharply, rising from 3% in 1929 to 25% in 1933. There was a drought in the rural areas of the Great Plains, which, combined with deficiencies in agricultural practices that led to extensive soil erosion, caused an environmental disaster. The cities have been bombarded by dust storms for several years. The population, losing their homes and livelihoods in the dusty cauldron, migrated further west, mainly to California, taking on any low-paying job and bringing down wages there, which were already low due to the economic crisis. The local authorities were looking for a way out of the situation in the deportation of illegal immigrants from Mexico. In the American South, the already fragile economy was collapsing. Rural residents migrated north en masse in search of work in industrial centers, in particular, Detroit. In the Great Lakes region, farmers, suffering from lower prices for their products, flooded the courts with private bankruptcy cases. From the United States, the crisis spread to the rest of the capitalist world. Industrial production decreased in the USA by 46%, in the UK by 24%, in Germany by 41%, in France by 32%. The share prices of industrial companies fell by 87% in the USA, by 48% in the UK, by 64% in Germany, and by 60% in France. Unemployment has reached colossal proportions. According to official data, in 1933, there were 30 million unemployed people in 32 capitalist countries, including 14 million in the United States. These circumstances required state intervention in the economy, the use of methods of state influence on spontaneous processes in the capitalist economy, in order to avoid shocks, which accelerated the development of monopolistic capitalism into state monopolistic capitalism. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate, came to power in the United States, offering the American people a New Deal, as his policies later became known. The Republicans, who were blamed, if not for the onset of the economic crisis, then for their inability to cope with it, suffered a crushing defeat in the 1932 presidential election and could not occupy the White House for many years afterwards. The success of the New Deal was such that Roosevelt became the only president in the history of the United States to be re-elected 4 times in a row, and he remained in power until his death in 1945. Although many of his administration's measures were later deemed controversial, a number of innovations from that period, such as the Social Security Program, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, are still in effect in the United States. President Roosevelt's most successful initiative is considered to be helping the unemployed, who were commissioned by the federal government to work in the Civilian Environmental Protection Corps and a number of other government services. It should also be noted that this course was initiated by the previous President Hoover, who created the Reconstructive Finance Corporation, law of January 22, 1932, which assisted in financing trade, industry, and agriculture, and provided loans to banks and insurance companies. During the year, the corporation issued loans in the amount of $2 billion. This did not stop the crisis, but postponed it. There were other actions to end the crisis, but they had only a partial effect and did not bring the expected result. The budget was spent a lot on anti-crisis measures, but not enough. In general, Hoover's contribution to the fight against the crisis cannot be overlooked. Although the measures taken by the Roosevelt administration prevented further curtailment of production, or at least alleviated the effects of the economic crisis on the general population, in the end, the Great Depression ended in America only with the outbreak of World War II. The administration began financing military orders, while the production of civilian products declined sharply, and its consumption became quota-based. This allowed the economy to cope with difficulties. From 1939 to 1944, production almost doubled. Unemployment fell from 14% in 1940 to less than 2% in 1943, although the labor force grew by 10 million people. World War II, 1939 to 1945. As during World War I, the United States did not enter World War II for a long time. However, as early as September 1940, the United States, under the Lend-Lease program, provided assistance with weapons to Great Britain, which fought alone against Nazi Germany after the occupation of France. The United States also supported China, which was waging war with Japan and declared an embargo on oil supplies to Japan. After the German attack on the USSR in June 1941, the Lend-Lease program was extended to the USSR. On December 7, 1941, Japan unexpectedly attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, justifying its actions by referring to the American embargo. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. In response, Germany declared war on the United States. At first, the situation in the Pacific Theater of Operations was unfavorable for the United States. On December 10, 1941, the Japanese launched an invasion of the Philippines, and by April 1942, they had completely occupied them. Most of the American and Filipino troops stationed there were captured. But the Battle of Midway Atoll on June 4th, 1942, was a turning point in the Pacific War. On November 8th, 1942, American troops under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, consisting of 3 corps, Western, Central, and Eastern, with the support of 1 British division, landed on the Atlantic coast of Morocco and on the Mediterranean coast in Algeria, in territories controlled by the Vichy puppet government. By May 1943, the German and Italian forces in North Africa had been defeated. On July 10, 1943, the American 7th Army and the British 8th Army successfully landed on the southern coast of Sicily. Italians have long understood that the war the Duchy dragged them into was not in Italy's interests. King Victor Emmanuel III decided to arrest Mussolini. When Mussolini was arrested on July 25, 1943, the new Italian government, led by Marshal Badoglio, began secret negotiations with the American command for an armistice. On September 8th, Badoglio officially announced the unconditional surrender of Italy, and on September 9th, 1943, the American 5th Army landed in the Salerno area. According to the decision of the Tehran Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met, the second front of the war with Germany was opened on June 6, 1944, when the troops of the United States, Great Britain, and Canada landed in Normandy. The operation ended on August 31st, with the liberation of the entire northwestern part of France. Paris was liberated on August 25th with the support of the French partisans. On August 15th, American-French troops landed in southern France, where they liberated the cities of Toulon and Marseille. After a series of military setbacks in the autumn and winter of 1944, at the end of March 1945, the 6th, 12th, and 21st Allied Army groups crossed the Rhine, and in April surrounded and defeated the Ruhr grouping of German troops. On April 25th, the 1st American Army met with Soviet troops on the Elbe River. On May 8th, Nazi Germany surrendered. In the Pacific Theater of Operations, in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history took place in Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy suffered catastrophic losses, after which the American Navy gained absolute supremacy at sea. Japanese aviation also suffered catastrophic losses from the superior U.S. Air Force. On October 20th, the Americans, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, began landing on the island of Leyte, southern Philippines, and cleared it of Japanese troops by December 31st. On January 9th, 1945, the Americans landed on the main island of the Philippine archipelago of Luzon. During January and February, most of the Japanese troops in Luzon were defeated, and Manila was liberated on March 3rd. By May, most of the Philippines had been liberated, with only remnants of Japanese troops in the mountains and jungles continuing to resist until August. On February 19th, 1945, the U.S. Marines landed on the island of Iwo Jima, where the Japanese put up strong resistance. Nevertheless, by March 26th, the island was captured. On April 1st, American troops landed on Okinawa Island with the support of the U.S. Navy and the British Navy, and captured it by June 22nd. In 1942, the Manhattan Project began to be implemented in the United States, as a result of which an atomic bomb was created by the summer of 1945. In July 1945, the Allies presented Japan with an ultimatum, but she refused to capitulate. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 Superfortress bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and on August 9th on Nagasaki, which caused enormous destruction. See atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the only example in the history of mankind of the combat use of nuclear weapons. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced the unconditional surrender of Japan. The Act of Surrender of Japan was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship of the U.S. Navy Missouri. The United States during the Cold War, 1945 and 1991, the beginning of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to 1964. In the history of the United States, 1945 and 1964 was a period of economic growth and prosperity. Politically, it was a period of triumph for the Black Civil Rights Movement, which ended racial segregation laws in the southern states. On December 4th, 1945, the US Congress approved membership in the United Nations, thereby moving away from the traditional policy of isolationism towards greater involvement in international relations. After World War II, the United States became one of the two world superpowers along with the USSR, and the Cold War began, in which both states tried to increase their influence in the world and began an arms race. The result was a series of conflicts, including the Korean War and the Caribbean crisis. One of the consequences of the Cold War was also the space race between the USA and the USSR. The first half of the 1950s was marked by the era of McCarthyism, which was expressed in harsh anti-communism and persecution of political opponents who were called anti-American. These years were also accompanied by increased propaganda of racism and chauvinism. However, by the second half of the 1950s, the struggle against racial segregation was gradually gaining momentum, and in 1963, John F. Kennedy, under pressure from numerous protests, introduced a civil rights bill to Congress prohibiting segregation in all public places. During this period, the White House was occupied mainly by Democrats Harry Truman, 1945-1953, John F. Kennedy, 1961-1963, and Lyndon Johnson, 1963-1969, but Republican Dwight Eisenhower, 1953-1961, remained president for most of the 1950s. In 1960, the charismatic leader John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. He was shot dead in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, and his murder came as a shock to U.S. citizens. Countercultural Revolution and Détente, 1964-1980. President Lyndon Johnson, who came to power in 1963, proclaimed the policy of a great society, which meant measures to reduce social inequality. During the 1960s, a number of social programs were launched. Racial discrimination was prohibited by law. During this period, the United States became involved in the Vietnam War, the unpopularity of which contributed to the emergence of anti-war social movements, particularly among women, minorities, and youth. Feminism and the environmental movement began to play a prominent role in domestic politics. In addition, the United States, like most of the Western world, was gripped by the countercultural revolution in the 1960s. The year 1968 was one of the turning points in the history of the United States. On April 4th, Martin Luther King, the leader of the movement for the rights of black citizens, was assassinated in Memphis, and on June 5th, Senator and presidential candidate Robert Kennedy was shot dead in Los Angeles. In 1969, Richard Nixon succeeded Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. By this time, the post-war period of economic prosperity had ended, and the United States experienced a deep economic crisis in the 1970s due to increased international economic competition, followed by a sharp increase in oil and other commodity prices. Although Nixon promised to end the Vietnam War during the election, it continued for several more years, despite the protests of American citizens. An example of anti-war demonstrations is the article Shooting at the University of Kent. It was not until 1973 that American troops were finally withdrawn from South Vietnam after the Paris Agreement. The Americans lost 58,000 people during the war. Nixon used the conflict between the Soviet Union and the PRC to benefit the United States by moving closer to the PRC. There was a thaw in the Cold War, known as détente. In August 1974, Nixon was forced to resign in disgrace due to the Watergate political scandal. Under his successor, Gerald Ford, the pro-American South Vietnamese regime collapsed. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. The United States suffered from the energy crisis, economic growth slowed. Unemployment and interest rates on loans remained high. On the world stage, Carter was known as a mediator in the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. In 1979, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. Carter failed to resolve this conflict and lost the 1980 election to Republican Ronald Reagan, who promised to bring morning to America. Reaganomics and the End of the Cold War, 1981-1991. After coming to power, Reagan began to implement the so-called Reaganomics policy, which consisted in stimulating production by reducing taxation while cutting social programs. In 1982, the United States experienced another short-term recession, when the unemployment rate and the number of bankruptcies were close to the level of the Great Depression. But starting next year, the situation changed dramatically. Inflation fell from 11% to 2%, unemployment to 7.5%, and economic growth increased from 4.5% to 7.2%. At least in part, this is due to falling oil prices and the proliferation of energy-saving technologies. At first, Reagan pursued a course of fierce confrontation with the USSR and called the Soviet Union an evil empire. But Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the USSR in 1985 and his perestroika policy changed Soviet-American relations. Reagan met with Gorbachev 4 times and signed the Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate-Range and Shorter-Range Missiles. Their partnership precipitated the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the 1988 presidential election, former Reagan Vice President George H.W. Bush was elected President of the United States. Under his leadership, U.S. troops invaded Panama in 1989 and ended the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait in 1991 as a result of a multinational military operation authorized by the UN Security Council. The United States between the Cold War and the economic crisis, 1991-2008. The presidency of Bill Clinton. In the 1992 presidential election, Republican George H.W. Bush was not re-elected to a second term, but was defeated by Democrat Bill Clinton. Clinton led the country through the longest period of peacetime economic growth in American history. He signed the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Violent Crimes and Law Enforcement Act, but failed to implement his National Health Reform Plan. In the field of U.S. foreign policy, Clinton launched a military intervention in Bosnia, eventually signing the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995, and later intervening in the Kosovo conflict in 1999, launching the bombing of Yugoslavia. He also called for the expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe, and some of the former Warsaw Pact members joined NATO during his presidency, the fourth enlargement. Clinton's foreign policy in the Middle East led to his participation in the Camp David Summit to advance the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and assist the peace process in Northern Ireland. Clinton's second term as president was marked by the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which began in 1995 when he had a sexual relationship with the then 22-year-old White House intern. In January 1998, news of the affair made headlines in the tabloids. The House of Representatives impeached Clinton, making him the second U.S. president to be impeached, after Andrew Johnson. In 1999, the Clinton impeachment trial began in the Senate, where he was acquitted of all charges. The presidency of George W. Bush. In one of the most controversial presidential elections in the country's history, on November 7, 2000, after a recount of votes and 5 weeks of legal proceedings, Republican George W. Bush defeated Democratic candidate Albert Gore. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and the War on Terrorism. On September 11, 2001, the United States was struck by a series of terrorist attacks that took place with the support of Al-Qaeda. 19 suicide bombers took control of 4 passenger airliners, killing the crew members before that, and sent the aircraft towards Washington, 1 to the Pentagon, 2 to the Twin Towers, and 1 missed the terrorists' target. Within 2 hours, both Twin Towers of the World Trade Center completely collapsed, causing huge damage to the surrounding area and covering Manhattan with clouds of toxic dust. A total of 2,977 people died as a result of the attacks. In response, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror on September 20th. On October 7, 2001, the United States and NATO invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime, which had provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. After the terrorist attacks, the federal government took new internal measures to prevent future attacks. The Department of Homeland Security was created to lead and coordinate federal counterterrorism activities. Some of these anti-terrorism measures, in particular the U.S. government's treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, have led to accusations of human rights violations against the U.S. government. From March 19th to May 1st, 2003, the United States launched the invasion of Iraq, which led to the collapse of the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein. The reasons for the invasion cited by the Bush administration included the spread of democracy, the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, and the liberation of the Iraqi people from their government's dictatorship. Despite some initial successes at the start of the invasion, the ongoing Iraq War caused international protests and a gradual decline in domestic support for Bush, as many began to question whether the invasion was worth the cost. In 2007, George W. Bush deployed more troops as part of the strategy. Although the death toll had decreased, political stability in Iraq remained in question. The United States, after the outbreak of the global economic crisis since 2008, financial crisis and recession. In 2008, the unpopularity of President Bush and the Iraq War, as well as the 2008 financial crisis, led to the election of the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama. After his election, Obama reluctantly continued military operations in Iraq until August 31, 2010, when he announced a cessation of hostilities. Nevertheless, 50,000 American soldiers and military personnel were kept in Iraq to assist Iraqi forces, to protect the withdrawing forces, and to fight terrorism until December 15, 2011, when the war was officially ended and the last troops left the country. At the same time, Obama has stepped up American involvement in Afghanistan, launching a build-up strategy using an additional 30,000 troops, proposing to begin withdrawing troops in December 2014. Obama banned torture, but generally retained Bush's policy regarding the prison at Guantanamo, although he proposed to close it. In May 2011, the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was killed in Pakistan during a raid conducted by U.S. Naval Special Forces, after he had been hiding for over a decade. While Al-Qaeda was on the verge of collapse in Afghanistan, its affiliated organizations continued to operate in Yemen and other remote areas. Drones were used to target terrorist leaders. On December 28, 2014, President Obama officially ended the operation in Afghanistan and promised the withdrawal of all remaining American troops by the end of 2016, with the exception of embassy guards. In September 2008, the United States and much of Europe entered the longest recession since World War II, often referred to as the Great Recession. The financial crisis threatened the stability of the entire economy in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and other giant banks were in serious danger. Since October, the federal government has provided $245 billion to financial institutions as part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. The recession officially ended in June 2009, and the economy gradually began to recover. The unemployment rate peaked at 10.1% in October 2009, after rising from 4.7% in November 2007 and returned to 5.0% in October 2015. However, overall economic growth in the 2010s remained weaker than in previous decades. The debate on rights for the LGBT community, especially same-sex marriage, began to shift in favor of same-sex couples and was reflected in dozens of surveys published at the beginning of the decade. In 2012, President Obama became the first president to openly support same-sex marriage. In June 2015, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage at the national level. The presidency of Barack Obama, 2009-2017. In 2010, Barack Obama, despite the resistance of Republicans, achieved the adoption of the health care reform law. In 2011, the American Army, by order of Obama, participated in the NATO intervention in Libya. The presidency of Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021, on November 8, 2016, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump defeated Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. The 2016 elections proved controversial after U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that Russian government officials had interfered in the elections to undermine public faith in the democratic process in the United States. This, along with questions about potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officials, led the FBI, the Senate, and the government to launch an investigation into the matter. In September 2019, a political crisis broke out in the United States over a call from U.S. Presidents Donald Trump and Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky. The COVID-19 pandemic. The worldwide pandemic of the COVID-19 virus which came to the United States, was first confirmed in January 2020. By February soon, the Trump administration had restricted travel to and from China. On March 11th, WHO declared the virus a pandemic. In March, many state and local governments introduced stay-at-home orders to slow the spread of the virus in an effort to reduce patient congestion in hospitals. By March 26th, according to the New York Times, the United States had the highest number of known cases of the disease among all countries. By March 27th, more than 100,000 cases of the disease had been reported in the country. On April 2nd, at the direction of President Trump, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and the CDC issued additional preventive guidelines for long-term care facilities. On April 11th, the number of deaths in the United States became the highest in the world when the death toll reached 20,000, surpassing that of Italy. On April 19th, CMS introduced new rules requiring nursing homes to inform residents, their families, and representatives about COVID-19 cases in their facilities. On April 28th, the total number of confirmed cases nationwide exceeded 1 million. As of May 2022, there are officially more deaths from COVID-19 in the United States than in any other country, with the death toll reaching 1 million, with the death toll in the United States exceeding the death toll during the Spanish flu pandemic, although 1 in every 150 Americans died from the Spanish flu, while COVID-19 killed every 1 in 500 Americans. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, life expectancy in the United States decreased by more than a year in 2020, and the unemployment rate rose to the worst levels since the Great Depression. In 2021, life expectancy in the United States decreased by about 6 months. Protests against racism. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd, an African-American man, died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, after police officer Derek Chauvin pressed his neck with his knee to the asphalt. Floyd's death sparked massive anti-racist protests. During the protests, there were calls to cut police funding under the slogan, "Defund the Police." On June 16th, President Trump signed an executive order on police reform, which should motivate police departments to recruit staff from local residents of patrolled areas, reduce police violence, and prioritize the use of social workers and psychiatric clinic staff instead of police officers. The 2020 presidential election. Former Vice President and Democratic Senator Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris defeated Trump in the 2020 presidential election. Harris is the first female, first black vice president of Asian descent, and Biden became the oldest president upon taking office. For the first time, the elections were held in compliance with sanitary measures related to the spread of coronavirus infection, and mail-in voting became the main way to make a vote for a candidate. After the election, Trump repeatedly made statements about alleged massive electoral fraud and the theft of 2.7 million votes by the Democrats. On January 6, 2021, the Congress building was seized by Trump supporters during the Electoral College vote count. This led to the blocking of the Twitter account of Donald Trump, and then all the social networks of the Republican leader. Additional efforts were also made by Democrats to resume the campaign to remove President Trump from office. Joe Biden's presidency, 2021-2025. On January 20th, 2021, Joe Biden assumed the office of President of the United States. In the early days of his presidency, he canceled some of Trump's decrees. He stopped withdrawing from the WHO and the Paris Climate Agreement. The construction of a wall on the border with Mexico allowed citizens from a number of Muslim and African countries to enter the United States, and canceled the construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline at the request of environmentalists. On March 2nd, he imposed sanctions on Russia over the attempted poisoning of Alexei Navalny in August 2020. In foreign policy, Biden led the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, 2021, and ended the war in Afghanistan, which led to the fall of the Afghan government and the seizure of control by the Taliban. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 2022, he imposed sanctions against Russia and announced the provision of civilian and military assistance to Ukraine. During the war between Israel and Hamas, 2023, Biden condemned the actions of Hamas and other Palestinian militants as terrorism announced military support for Israel, and sent limited humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilian population in the Gaza Strip. On January 7, 2025, wildfires began to spread in the Los Angeles metropolitan area and surrounding areas, aggravated by very low humidity, prolonged drought, and hurricane-force Santa Ana winds, which in some places exceeded 130 km/h. The death toll is at least 24